Well, good morning. I'm Joel Barna. I'm in Albuquerque. I'm saying this for anyone who doesn't know me or doesn't know where I am. I am going to give a talk this morning based on an intensive that I've been involved in for the last several days, beautifully organized by Kim Mosley, who's our doshi for today. And I have really enjoyed the chance to work with him and to work with the people who participated in the intensive. It's very transformative for me, even though it was very short. We started on Thursday night. We met for a few hours on Friday, and then during most of the day yesterday. And I have friends who are in the Rinzai tradition. You know, one of them recently remarked, he said, "You call that an intensive? An intensive starts at 3 o'clock in the morning and goes until dark, and you don't do anything but sit." And yeah, I do call it an intensive because it really, I feel different after the experience of it. Mostly because of the wonderful things I learned from talking with and hearing the other participants. And then, of course, after I talk, we're going to have this ceremony, the head students entry ceremony for Jess MB, who's going to be the head student for the practice period that starts, I guess, today or tomorrow. And I want to draw that together with some of the things that or the main thrust of what we discussed during the intensive. As I said, I've been participating in an intensive the last few days, and the focus of the intensive was the skandhas. This is a Pali word, or actually a Sanskrit word. The skandhas are the aggregates or heaps of physical and psychological phenomena as defined in the Buddha's teachings that make up the process of how humans apprehend the world and their own place in the world. Underlying that, in our goals for the intensive, and underlying the Buddha's teachings about the skandhas, was the Buddha's effort to dispel the mistaken notion that we are separate selves, and that the separate self stands somehow apart from a completely interpenetrating, completely interactive, ever-changing composite world. And underlying that was the Buddha's effort the Buddha's compassionate effort to relieve suffering, to relieve human suffering. As laid out in the teachings, there are 5 skandhas: form, feeling tone, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. And what's amazing to me is that the Buddha and the people who followed him and wrote down his teachings in a time before writing was common, and most teachings were passed on orally, came up with a sophisticated delineation of human thought processes that combine epistemology, that is how we apprehend the world, with depth psychology. And I'm fascinated particularly by the second link in the chain, the feeling tone, what is in Sanskrit, Vedana, because it shapes everything that follows below the level of what we can normally perceive. And I'll touch on that later. I want to start, I'll explain some more about the skandhas, pardon me, and I want to end up talking about not just these teachings, but about their moral implications for us, what they direct us to do, not as individual selves, but as the philosopher and cognitive scientist and Buddhist Jay Garfield says, not as selves, but as persons. I want to start with an analogy. About 15 years ago, when I was a fundraiser, I went on a visit with a donor to a Lockheed Martin factory in Fort Worth. There was a single building that was about a mile long, and materials would come in pretty much at one end, and a multi-million-dollar F-16 fighter plane came out the other. It was a long assembly line with incredible numbers of workers and mind-boggling technology going into it. With the theory of the Skandhas, the Buddhas showed very convincingly, I think, how our minds take sensory impressions and then through a series of steps that typically flash by faster than we can ever appreciate, we then produce two different things. Our understanding of what's going on outside of us, having filtered it through our memories and filtered it through the languaging processes inside our heads, and a sense that we are a self, a separate entity that's set off from the rest of the world. The Buddha taught that we need to investigate this process and understand the ways it creates suffering for us. I want to give a breakdown of the Skandhas here, and this is actually from a piece that was in Tricycle, written by a teacher named Sean Murphy, and it's based on his recollections of teachings decades ago given by the late Bernie Glassman. The way that Bernie Glassman restated the language of the Skandhas in a more contemporary or more apprehensible way, as described by Sean Murphy, is, number one, sensation. Direct experience through the senses of the physical world, similar to the traditional version of form that I stated before, although perhaps this version clarifies the point that even what we think of as objective physical reality is already mediated through our senses, and our senses are very limited. Feeling is the second one, our simplest internal response to any sensation, like, dislike, or indifference, that is, leaning toward, leaning back from, or trying to ignore. That's pretty much the same as in the traditional system, Sean Murphy says. The third is reaction. Our feeling of dislike or like or neutrality then provokes a reaction that changes from leaping to our feet if we hear a loud noise to a subtle contraction or relaxation of the body. Such reactions may also include complex emotional responses, such as anger, fear, or envy, things that arise in the brain, and thus include aspects of the traditional fourth skandha, mental formations. And then for the fourth restatement of the skandha, mental formations, Bernie Glassman called it recognition or interpretation. The mind catches up with an experience and applies a label to it. In the example above, we've heard a loud noise. We've disliked it and leaped to our feet, having a reaction, before realizing that it's actually something that we don't have to worry about, like a car backfiring or something. This is essentially the same as the traditional third skandha. And then finally, consciousness. As Bernie Glassman explained, this is just ordinary human consciousness as average people experience it, or as we typically experience it when we're being normal human beings. The key aspect for our purposes is that this is where we download the storehouse of past experiences and concepts, and thereby obscure the direct experience of the first skandha, sensation, often creating confusion and suffering in the process. There are many different versions of a famous Buddhist story of a man who goes to a inn or like a hostel while he's traveling, and he's in a dark room, and in the dim light of this relatively dark room, he notices something in the corner, and it seems to be long and dark, and he imagines it's a snake, and for the rest of the night he is expecting the snake to come and bite him. And so he's living that night in fear until the dawn comes and light comes in, and he sees it's just a rope that was there. This is the parable of the rope that was mistaken for a snake. This is something that we do over and over again in our lives because of the processes through the skandhas. Tara Brach, a teacher whom I enjoy listening to a lot, has talked about this in many of the YouTube videos that I've seen. And she describes it as a process of creating for ourselves a kind of armor or a spacesuit that is protective at first, but then turns into a way of cutting us off from the world, that we get trapped within our own interpretations instead of being open to what's actually going on. And so in recent years, a number of modern cognitive scientists and neuroscientists, most of them trained in Buddhism in one way or another, have approached the same issues and have come up with different mechanisms or parallel mechanisms to what's described in the skandhas. And I talked about this some during the intensive. There's a cognitive and neuroscientist, Chris Niebuhr, has a book called No Self, No Problem, describing the process of self-making and how that produces suffering by talking about the two sides of the brain. In very brief synopsis, he says, we encounter something through sensory impressions, and then our brainstem provides a feeling tone. That is the most lizard-like part of our brain, which is involved in protecting us against threats and keeping us alive. And that actually is the part of the brain that keeps our heart pumping without us having to think about it, keeps our lungs working, keeps our digestive system working without us having to think about it, even when we're asleep, unconscious. So it does things below the level of consciousness that are absolutely necessary for us to live. So there's that happens. We get this feeling tone first from that part of the brain. Then he says the right side of the brain takes in the information and holds it in a global kind of accepting framework. And I could talk about the right side of the brain for a long time, but time is limited. So I'll just say, just know that there's part of our brain that always is available to us that is accepting and not differentiating and not rejecting. So there's that. It's not involved, that the right side of the brain is not involved in the construction of the spacesuit. Then the left side of the brain, a fraction of a second later, and this is something which I've remarkably, to me, been able to perceive in meditation, that there's a little temporal gap between physical sensation, feeling tone, and then this kind of walk into the languaging part of my brain, the left side. The left side of the brain, which notices patterns. It specializes in noticing patterns and sorting them into categories and overlaying categories on what has come in through the senses and turning those experiences into language. Now, in our culture, I don't know how it is in other cultures. I hear other cultures have some differences in this, but in our culture, that means turning processes into nouns, into things that we then are like. In an analogy in physics, which I used to be the fundraiser for the astrophysics department at the University of Texas, so I heard about this a lot. But there's an analogy that subatomic particles, if you look for them as discrete chunks, as particles, they will act like discrete chunks. But if you look away and don't look for them in that way, they will act like waves, which interpenetrate with each other and interact with each other. And so it depends on how you're looking as to what you're going to see. So in our languaging, we tend to turn processes into nouns. And Niebuhr says that in this process, we are committing one mistake after another. We are making inferences about what we encounter inferences that can be useful, and in fact are, I mean, if I didn't have some sense that the camera that I'm looking at right now is going to work because it worked a minute ago, I couldn't continue with this talk. These are useful inferences, but if we are taking them as the ultimate truth about who we are in relation to the world, we are confusing uh, uh, inferences for ultimate truth and causing, and that leads to suffering for us uh, because the world is always changing. The Buddha said this: the world is always interpenetrating and always changing, and we cannot make things solid that are not solid, and that effort causes us pain. And as he, again, just he says, we are inferring a separate self, which we then treat as real. So he says the left side of the brain creates an illusion by noticing a pattern of categorical differences and between ourselves and other things and other people, and combining these observations with memory, preferences, and the perspective of the pilot, who seems to be steering the ship of our brain and body. And he says, our definition of self depends in part on our differences from others. There's no me without not me. This is fairly easy to see in our own life. You may categorize yourself and define yourself in relation to others. He writes, for me, I use descriptors like father, professor, author to distinguish me from anyone around me. How do you do it? If you feel you are funny and intelligent, that judgment places you in social categories that depend upon other people being boorish and not so smart. Otherwise, your categories would have no meaning. If you are an extrovert, you need introverts for a comparison. If you are male, you need female in the same way we see in the classic reversible symbol of Taoism. Yang needs yin to define what it is. He concludes, you want to be smarter, more attractive, more successful, and all of these ideas are in fact problems. The great tragedy here is that we never realize that none of these conditions will ever be met completely to the satisfaction of the self that's created by the left side of the brain, because the self must continue to think in order to stay in existence. It must continue to come up with irresolvable categorical differences. Therefore, it's always changing the measuring stick, always adding a new better to fall short of. As a reminder, he writes, when I say we suffer, in this context, I mean we generate thoughts and feelings of sadness, disappointment, grief, what have you, as we reject one imaginary version of ourselves in favor of another. This is simply the left brain doing its thing and nothing more. When we identify entirely with the left brain and what it believes that it is, it believes that it's us, however, the suffering can be overwhelming. Then he spends the rest of the book describing yoga and meditation and other body-centered practices which open us to the possibility of connecting with this global sense of who we are, of what the world is, without these invidious comparisons that we make. This had a profound effect on me over the weekend. I'll just say, I was sitting in meditation, I was watching my mind just spinning so fast, coming up with crazy, that I was trying to connect with my breath, but my mind was saying, maybe I should, I was looking across the room in my office here and thinking, well, I could put a bookcase over there. Should I look on IKEA.com or should I look at Home Depot or, and those thoughts were very difficult to disengage from. And then I thought, and then it occurred to me that Dogen said, when we sit in meditation, it doesn't matter what our mind is doing. Simply by sitting upright, we are enacting Buddha mind. And I thought, well, what is an acting Buddha mind right now? It's like, well, I have some muscles in my back that are holding my spine upright and that are, interacting with muscles in my neck that are holding up this big, heavy head that I have. And they don't have a voice. They're not saying anything, even though they are providing lots of information. All my body is providing lots of information, but it doesn't get into words. It's only the things that I can filter through comparisons that get turned into words. So I talked about this yesterday at the end of our um, time together, and I said I think I'm going to be working on this opening for the rest of my practice life. That was a profound change for me to just realize the possibilities that come from this. So I said earlier that I was going to talk about the moral implications of engaging with this insight that the Buddha had about the skandhas. And it's not, this sounds like pretty heady stuff. It's all about ideas. It's all about psychology. And so what do you do with it? Well, there's a cognitive scientist who's also a Buddhist practitioner and a writer named Jay Garfield. And he wrote a book that came out a few years ago called Losing Ourselves. And he posits that cognitive science, he's going along the same paths that Niebuhr has explored. And he says cognitive science does not give any indication that there is a separate self, but that in fact the Buddha was right, and everything is always completely interpenetrating and always changing. And so there's really no factual basis that we can rely on for the sense of an ego or a central self or something like that. And he says, consciousness and experience emerge from distributed processes in the brain, aligning with a broader claim that the self is a constructed phenomenon rather than a fundamental reality. And he turns this very interesting use of language. He turns this from describing us not as selves, not like, subatomic particles, but as persons who are more like waves, always intrinsically interactive and interdependent. And then he describes the moral implications of this. What do persons do? What do selves do? Selves act like they have an intrinsic right to be selfish. They have an intrinsic right to focus only on their own needs, desires, wants, to the exclusion of everything else. He said persons don't act that way. Persons recognize interdependence. And what do? He says, basically, they come down to the Brahma Viharas. They live a life that is infused with 4 qualities. The first Brahma Vihara, loving kindness, connection with other people. The second one, compassion, and a desire to alleviate the suffering of others. And third, sympathetic joy, the ability to not always focus on only getting what you want, but to actually be happy for other people when they are happy. And finally, equanimity, the ability to hold these qualities and our inevitable failings with these qualities with patience, so that we can move forward in a connected way with other people. So these are and to tie this in with what Niebuhr was saying before, these are qualities that are associated with the right side of the brain, the global sense of interconnectedness that is always with us and is always available to us, and that we can access by, in a self-compassionate way, examining how we hold ourselves as separate entities, as selves. So what does this have to do with what's going to happen next? The head student ceremony. entry ceremony that we're about to not just witness, but affirm by our presence. Think of that. I got to officiate at a wedding a couple of years ago. I had to ordain as a Dudist priest in order to do it. I have a Dudist priest certificate in a folder here. But what is most amazing about a wedding is that the people who are there are creating the conditions for a marriage. Not just the two people getting married, but the community that is going to support them in a loving way through the rest of their lives together. And that is a critical component. It's not just a profession of one person to another. It is the whole community coming together in support. And that's what we are about to do. We are coming together in support of what will be a transformative ceremony for Jess. He will walk in the door as one person, and he will come out as a different person, not a different self, but a different person in interaction with all of us, in interaction with the world. So with that, I conclude and I thank you. And now we turn to this beautiful ceremony.